The study of fashion and costume is fascinating not only for the artistry and skilled craftsmanship it reveals, but also for the many queries posed by the message contained in dress. Joan Nunn. That is a quick excerpt from the introduction of Fashion and Costume, 1200 to 2000 by Joan Nunn. This is hopefully one in a long series of book reviews that I'll be doing of the books that I started collecting in college and made a bad habit of that I now have to deal with. This is a way to sort of guilt me into not purchasing these books as often. I say that and I bought 2 more this January, so I'm a liar and a fraud. I got this particular book during a book exchange in college. So I ended up getting it for free. It retails for about, I was looking online, $13 to like 20 something dollars. It's not that expensive and it has a lot of beautiful information. I want to tell you how long it took me to read, but honestly I stopped timing it because I forgot and I just sort of got sucked in. At that point it was like mind over matter of how much I desperately wanted to finish the book. So I'll tell you that the timer stopped at like an hour and 33 minutes. I'm about to go through the whole book with you. I have notes for every chapter. It is a large swath of history. The first chapter is going to be 1200 to 1450, the Gothic period. Here is some of the illustrations from that period. Beautiful. The chapter has a good balance of rich and working class clothing. It mentions undergarments such as like braids, chemise and smocks, and hose, which was very lovely to see. There was also a lot of beautiful information about like the bright and rich colorings of the period. The fabrics that are used and the patterns that are used, especially throughout the period, are very, very talked through, which is #love gorgeous. Traditional designers typically sometimes forget, or the way that the public sees the period forgets about that like beautiful coloring. So this was really nice to see. A weird thing I noticed was the author just like gently graces the idea of sumptuary laws, which I found interesting since the rest of the chapter is so specific about things. Sumptuary laws are sort of just like what the poor can wear, and they can't wear what the rich wear or the royals wear, just sort of keep them in their social classes, and because merchants were getting kind of crazy at the time. It does delve into the differences in customs across Europe and within the trade routes, which was really lovely, and overall I would rate this particular chapter about an 8.5 out of 10. The next chapter is going to be 1450 to 1600, the Renaissance period. There is a lot of information in this chapter, and I'm going to warn you, I'm going to keep saying that for the rest of this book. German, Italian, Spanish, English, French, and Flemish is all touched on and graced on and talked over through this chapter. On page 29, she says, there is considerable national variation in dress at this time, although with increasing trade and travels, the exchange of fashion ideas was growing. Fashion during this particular chunk of time that she set apart is like changing in leaps and bounds. We have at the beginning of the period loose, free clothing, and then that's like juxtaposed with things such as with heavy structures such as like the farthingale and like cod pieces, which are a whole other scary thing that people wore. I highly recommend at this point reading the full chapter first and then scoping out and then looking at the illustrations. They don't super match up closely. It's not like a figure 1, figure 2 scenario where the text is talking about specific drawings. There's a lot of fabric information. It's music to my ears or eyes. Whatever. There's a lot of fabric information about what is used traditionally during this time period, which is very lovely. This chapter overall is like a solid 9 out of 10. The next chapter is going to be the 17th century. Personally, for me, 17th century is the best century. This one is before the Rococo period that people love, like Marie Antoinette, Louis XV. Don't quote me on that. I personally love this period the most. I think it's like beautifully ridiculous. The chapter starts off pretty strong with like an in-depth cultural discussion. There's a lot of stuff is going on in the world. There's a spread of foreign trade, the discovery, or not the discovery, but the more things are happening in the new world. And there's also like disgusting gross colonization, but it's a fact that it's happened and it has influenced a lot. So we do have to touch on that. She mentions a lot of interesting trim, ribbon, accessories, and like unneeded fashion things, from like crazy things that they're wearing around their necks to just like capes that are essentially a jacket. So you see the sleeves, but it's a cape. She also just has a habit of saying some pretty strange things. This in particular on page 58. The lavish use of ribbon loops on the shoulders and sleeves of the doublet and round the waist down the sides of the breeches contributed to a total image which may seem effeminate to modern eyes, but contemporary writing confirms that these gentlemen were not lacking in heterosexual inclination. So if you thought because they were wearing such pretty ribbons and gorgeous wigs and flounces and heels that they were gay, wrong. I mean, some of them probably were, but wrong. There is a small peasant and working class dress section, which sort of makes sense since the richer class is doing a lot of crazy things at this time. There's a lengthy and long shoe discussion. Another very topical thing I found that sort of relates to a modern thing is on page 72. Masks were worn out of doors to protect the skin, and night masks were coated inside with ointment to smooth the skin and prevent wrinkles. Reminds me a lot of those morning shed videos where people are like strapping things down and peeling masks off and lip masks and whatever things they have slung around their face. Anyways, I thought it was interesting. This chapter I would rank overall at a 9.5 out of 10. The next century is the 18th century. If you have trouble with numbers like I do, that is going to be the 1700s. Here's a little snippet of the illustrations. Once again, take a shot every time I say this, but not really. A lot of information to wade through in this period, and I was waiting. WADING. This is around when I would like read a chapter and then I would have to lay down and take a brain break because it was just so much. The French at this time are doing crazy things. They are doing absolutely buck wild things. There's a very lovely fabric rant in this chapter as well, which is like so nice to get that information personally if you're doing a design. There's also a really immaculate like hat and hair rant. Hair, the colors of the hair, they're talking about like blonde, brown, auburn, black, white, and even like blue powder that they use to powder the hair. Crazy stuff. Shout out to two of my favorite things. The polonaise, which is a bustling up of an overskirt to show the pretty underskirt, and échelles, which are essentially just like increasingly smaller bows that ladder down a bodice. I think they're very neat, and I think they're very cute. Once again, wish the text corresponded close to the illustrations. It makes it so hard to follow when you're reading. And you've got text, illustration, chunk of text, chunk of text. Don't worry about this full spread of illustrations. Don't worry about it because they don't correspond that closely with each other. There is sort of an insane last line of this chapter, personally, that it's on 102, page 102. Probably more than half of the population of Europe still lived meanly, owning little, toiling hard, and often hungry, and usually wretchedly clothed. Which is kind of a baller line, but I thought it was kind of a crazy thing to read in a book. Anyways, 8 out of 10. The next period is going to be 1800 to 1850. So for all of you Bridgerton girlies, this is that, or at least part of that. There was a very interesting classical influence, such as like ancient Greek and Roman fashion during this early part of the period. An odd thing that she does, that I think she also did in the previous chapter, was where she mentions something and then she doesn't elaborate on it, which it is odd because, as we've established, she loves to info dump. In this case, she mentions Spencer jackets, but does not elaborate on what those are. That being said, Spencer jacket, short waist to bust length jacket without tails, supposedly named after a Lord Spencer, who reportedly cut the tails off his jacket when it was burned, and it became quite the height of fashion. You just see it a lot. And it's sort of like militaristic, like they either have sleeves, they don't have sleeves, and they've got crazy trim and stuff, and it's just, they're very lovely jackets. But I thought it was weird that she didn't mention it any further. Well, crazy things are happening with trims and sleeves during this period. I feel like my phrasing sort of like repeats itself at this point. Poorer classes are not as different compared to the richer class as opposed to how they were in previous periods. The rich are still going crazy, but it's not as crazy. The wedding dress now is leaning more towards the standard of being a white or cream colored dress. Previously, it was just a nicer dress. And another thing that was just sort of a crazy line to read, kind of baller, line drop. It's on page 131. Prudery seems to have reigned supreme, and legs, if referred to at all, were called limbs, and men's trousers were known as unmentionables. The chapter overall ranks for me as a 7 out of 10, which I think is the lowest score that I am given. So the next chapter is going to be 1850 to 1850 to 1900. Yippee! For the invention of the sewing machine and widespread use of it starting in the 1850s. We love the ease of fashion spreading everywhere. At this point in time, there's also a quick little thing. There are clothes for what seem like every occasion. Time of day, sports, etc. Just so many clothes if you can afford it. Crinolines are doing some very crazy things, wacky things, about being like very wide and round to like oblonging and sort of making that bustle shape that everyone sort of knows from this period. Once again, girl has opinions, and they are once again kind of crazy. On page 137, she says, an enormous variety of styles was worn by women during this half-century, many of them remarkably ugly. The invention of the sewing machine seemed to have encouraged over-elaborate decoration, and the introduction of aniline dyes produced some garish colors. Personally, I love the sort of gaudiness of the era. I think it's so beautiful and so wonderful. And the brighter colors that are introduced because of those aniline dyes. Hats and flounces, you name it, they got it. The use of fur in clothing, I also noticed in this chapter, is incredibly widespread, and it goes from like coats to collars to trimmings to whatever you can put fur on, they put fur on. So this chapter is going to be an 8.5 out of 10 for me. The next chapter is they're sort of split up a little different than the rest of the book. This one is going to be 1900 to 1939, which you go, oh, that's an odd separation of years, but it's just what she did. And also because the first edition of this book came out in 1980. Or around, I shouldn't say that. The last section of this book in the first edition stopped at 1980, so that's why it's sort of separated like this. First of all, 1900s to 1939, R.I.P. Archduke Franz Ferdinand. He went out with a bang. There's a lovely list of designers that are being dropped in this chapter, such as Poiret, Coco Chanel, Elsa Schiaparelli, Fortuny, and others. Those are just the ones that are very sexy to me. We are now in a period where fine art and fashion are influencing each other immensely. Shout out, in specific, I didn't know this before I read this, the custom of the last button staying unbuttoned on a vest becoming popular during this time. She says on page 180, from 1908, the bottom button of the waistcoat was left alone, a fashion said to have been started by King Edward VII that lingered long after his death. This is also really the period where the commodification of clothes has like ramped up and allowed lower class access to fashionable styles, whether it's through a lower quality of cloth with the similar type of pattern, or being able to order things off of a catalog. There is also some beautiful hats are happening. They come in a variety of shapes, sizes, and different fancy. Hair is also getting pretty funky at this time. Beautiful hot irons, varying lengths. We get shorter hair a lot during this period, and gel. Media is becoming more accessible as well. So there's a lot more of being able to idolize someone for the way that they look. So, like, silver screen silent films, idolizing those actors and actresses for how they look and trying to fashion yourself based off of that is becoming a lot more widespread, which is really lovely to see because of how much that changes fashion. This chapter scored overall an 8.5 out of 10. I will tell you the way I mathematically do it, except I'm going purely based off vibes and specifics of whether things scratched my brain well or did not. This next chapter is 1940 to 1980. On page 207, she says, fashion as a resistant force and also an important source of trade, so that I'm gonna try that again. On page 207 in this chapter, she says that fashion is a resistant force and also an important source of trade, so that even during the war years, in areas away from the worst of the struggle, it continued to have a following. The chapter really starts off with, as they all do, a synopsis of the culture of the period. This specific period, 1940 to 1980, sort of drops us in the middle of a pretty pivotal war in history. But you learn such interesting things. Like, she has sort of a snippet of when the Germans took France, the courtiers were able to courtiers. I'll figure that out. They were able to keep some 100,000 skilled workers from being used as forced labor for the war industry, and were able to keep Paris as the center of women's fashion, which is sort of crazy. Here is a bit from that period. we are also now fully enveloped in that like consumer capitalistic age. So fashion trends are really going to ramp up in terms of speed, severity, and just how fast they die. Youth in this era are also pretty loudly and proudly against the status quo. We see things such as the Zoot Suit riots in Los Angeles and the greasers of the 1950s, and also different subcultures such as like punks, goths, and beatniks, who are also known as skinheads. This is where the first edition of the book ends, so the author, although like opinionated beforehand, sort of like ramps it up a notch. On page 239, she says, high heels and platform soles were reintroduced during the late 1970s for some of the most hideous, clumsy boots and shoes ever produced. Difficult to walk on with any ease or grace, they gave girls the appearance of having crippled feet. Which is a kind of crazy thing to say. You can also sort of tell very intensely during this period that she is incredibly British. Personally, I was expecting to see a lot of other things happening, and then I was like, this is becoming a very British lens of fashion, which is not bad, it's just different than what I'm personally used to. Synthetic fabrics are really becoming a status quo during this period, and everyone is really wearing them at this time. They're sort of getting crazy and out of hand. This chapter ranks at an 8 out of 10 for me. The next chapter, which is in addition to the previous, focuses on 1980 to 2000. This is the only part of the second edition of the book, so it reads very differently than the rest of the book. Much talk about Princess Di, and she is in actually a lot of the illustrations, as you can see on this page. Rest in power, Queen. Love you. Another thing she did that was just like such an odd thing to say was on page 253. She says, with the general increase of central heating, it seems that many young men reverted to the habit of their predecessors of sleeping in the nude or in their underwear. How do you know that? How do you know that? Anyways, this period has a lot more unisex clothing, and there's also an increase in a traditionally masculine silhouette seen in women's clothing than there has been previously. In my eyes, American fashions during this time period had more of a streetwear influence and bright colors that are not touched on as much in this chapter, which like sort of further cements the difference between my interpretation of the period as a mixed American versus her more British lens of seeing the period. On page 261, she also says something that I find strikes pretty close to the heart, which is, fashion cannot be dictated. It must come from the desire of a wide number to follow a certain look. Which is a nice thing to say, but also I rate this chapter at a 7.5 out of 10. And the thoughts is, if you've been keeping score with me, that is the end of the book. 1, fashion and costume. 2, if you've been keeping score, it sort of levels out to a 74.5 out of 90, which averages about to 8.3 out of 10. This is a good book. I won't say anything but that, but this is actually a very good book. It's not an introductory book to the topic at all. But if it starts to become a special interest of yours and you sort of want to know the ins and outs of your favorite fashion period, I would highly recommend it. As sort of stated beforehand, she does go heavily into detail. She talks about like half-inch differences in collar heights, or the way that pants and trousers sort of like rise and fall, and spacing of seams on women's bodices, which are, it's just a lot of information. Um, so if it's not something that you're like thoroughly interested in at the moment, then you sort of get a little lost in the sea of the words. But I do heavily recommend the book. The author herself has some very strong opinions about things, and is at times quite British. But she does give great information, if sometimes it's, as I said, a little too wordy. The book itself also has like a beautiful, I'm sorry, a beautiful bibliography and index. So, like, yay, super win. She cites all of the sources that she references in the text. It gives you a lot of other books to look out for, such as ones that I have read personally: History of Costume by Carl Kohler, History of Costume for the Stage by Lucy Barton, and also anything from Janet Arnold, which she also has dedicated this book to Janet Arnold, which is lovely. If you have read this book, please let me know your thoughts on it. It's very affordable. It retails, I think I said earlier, $13, 20 something ish American dollars. So it is an affordable book to purchase. And it does give you quite a wide scope of history, so I would highly recommend it. Yeah, if you stuck around for this long, thank you so much. If you did it and you skipped ahead, sucker. Thank you so much for listening to me yap. At some point, there will be more of this. Goodbye.